Thank you all for joining us for one of our fall lecture series. My name is Caroline Baxendale. I'm an intern at the Biscayne Community Foundation. And I'd like to introduce Dalton. He is a graduate student at the University of Miami. And he also manages the Rescue Reef program, and he's going to be talking about what the program does.
Exactly.
So thank you again for joining us, and please help me welcome Dalton.
Thank you. Like she mentioned, my name is Dalton Hesley. I'm a graduate student at the university there. My specific track is tropical marine ecosystem management, which pretty much just means I've been looking into how corals, mangroves, seagrasses, humans all interact, and the different things we can do and how we affect them, and where we're going forward. So, Rescue Reef. It's actually a local program here. I'm assuming not many of you know about it because it's fairly new, but it's growing. It's definitely growing, and the Key Biscayne community is actually one of the ones we're primarily trying to reach out to. So there's all my contact information, but of course, let me know if you need anything else. So Rescue Reef. We're here tonight because of citizen science. Citizen science is just an opportunity for the public to get involved in ongoing research or efforts or what have you in order to kind of contribute to the scientific community. Our program is special in that it's research that our laboratory has been conducting for about 8 years now already, and now we're opening the doors to the general public for their assistance. It's a great way for them to learn about our research, coral reefs, and then help make a difference. So I figured I would put a short little slideshow about our program first before we delve in. I will be giving a little background on coral reefs. So here you can see Dr. Diego Learman. He is the one that founded the Rescue Reef program. His laboratory has been working in coral restoration for, like I said, 8 years at the University of Miami. So this is not new to him. But here you can see he's leading a lecture before one of our expeditions, giving everyone a background on coral reefs, our work, and why it's important. So in there you can see here's our boat full of divers. We take divers and snorkelers along with us. And as you can see, they're right with us. You know, we're diving there, they're shoulder to shoulder with us. It's a very personal experience for everyone involved. And we actually go out right through Crandon Marina, through Divers Paradise. That's our dive shop. We collaborate with them. They let us charter their vessels so we can do our Rescue Reef expeditions. It's a really good relationship. So here you can see one of our divers. Her name is Rachel. She joined us on an expedition. She is working on our coral tree right now. She's collecting measurements. She's cleaning the tree, and she's just doing an overall survey. Here you can see our corals that we've collected. We work primarily with Acropora cervicornis, which is called staghorn coral. As you can see, we collect quite a large amount of it. So all of this would be then transferred to a locally degraded reef to then outplant. This is the final product. You can see one of our citizen scientists working in the background. And this is a small fragment of the staghorn coral, which is a threatened species in South Florida here. Attached to the coral. So before we get too much more into the citizen science, I just want to do a little background on coral reefs because we have a wide age range here, educational backgrounds. I thought it'd be beneficial. So we all know coral reefs are great. They're important. We all want to save them, but there's a lot of different reasons why. Not everyone realizes why. They're extremely diverse and productive, meaning I think around 90% of all species in the ocean use coral reefs at some point of their life cycle, feeding, predating, reproducing. It's very important habitat, and it's a very important habitat to us as well, and it's worldwide. So, to go really into the basics here, what is a coral? It seems like a silly question to some, but honestly, people have told us that corals are rocks, they're plants, they're animals. The actual answer is animal. So it's called a colonial animal because a single colony of coral is actually hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of polyps, which is the individual animal, all working together. Miami is great because I can use that as a prime example of how to imagine it. So you have these sky with the high-risers in Miami. Imagine if every single person that lived in that high-riser went out on their balcony. That individual person would be one coral polyp, and the entire high-riser would be the coral colony. So imagine if it was like raining Skittles and everyone was trying to grab them. That would be every individual coral polyp feeding. A professor told me that, I swear, I didn't make that up. So, here we have zoomed in on the actual coral polyp. So that's one little tiny coral polyp. And they are pretty normal in terms of what you would think they do. The best way to picture what a coral polyp is, it's like an upside down jellyfish, I would say, where it's actually attached at the base here, and its tentacles are going outward from the coral colony. They're used for feeding, collecting sun's energy for photosynthesis. They're all connected with nerves. They communicate to each other. They have a stomach. They have a mouth. Just the typical anatomy of like a jellyfish. So what's more important, though, in terms of feeding is that actively feeding, like I said with the Skittles or different dissolved organic material in the water column, isn't their main mode of feeding. They actually use photosynthesis. Not to get too specific, but they have zooxanthellae inside their cells. Zooxanthellae is a type of algae that is able to convert the energy from the sun, or the light from the sun, into energy, much like a plant. So that's why a lot of people mistake corals for plants, because they hear that majority of their energy comes from the sun. So it's really beneficial to have these symbiotic algae inside their cells, because then they don't have to work for food. They just host these cells, or these zooxanthellae, the algae, and they get energy, about 95% of the energy, in fact. So just to kind of zoom in here, you have the coral polyp cut in half, and then a single tentacle. Zoomed in on that tentacle, you can see the individual algae, or the zooxanthellae, inside the tissue. So every one of those symbionts, or the algae, the zooxanthellae, is using the light from the sun, converting it to energy for the coral. So that's really beneficial. The coral doesn't have to do anything. It just says, here's a home to the algae. The algae says, thank you for the home. Here's some energy. And it's called a symbiotic relationship. And it works really well for coral reefs. But that symbiotic relationship is being disturbed by many, many different factors that I will get into. So you guys have probably seen tons of different types of corals. I just wanted to go over this kind of briefly for South Florida. You have branching, massive, sometimes called brain, columnar, which is called finger coral sometimes, encrusting, plate-like. Here's some of the ones you'll see in the area. These are the brain corals I was referring to. That one's actually my favorite, Diploria laminiformes. Some more interesting looking corals. Here you can see the two threatened species that have been listed. You have, this is called elkhorn coral, that's called staghorn coral. Staghorn coral is what I'm holding here. This is an actual skeleton of staghorn coral. And that is the species that we use for all of our restoration work. Okay, so obviously, like I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of benefits to corals. We rely on them quite handily, and so do the animals that reside in them. So here are some of the main ones. Storm protection, especially in Miami here. Hurricane, any hurricane that comes through is going to be lessened quite significantly by the fact that that coral is out there, slowing down the wave energy. Building materials, I've actually nerded out a few times when I'm walking around Miami, because there's a lot of limestone that is fossilized coral found throughout the city. So it's a really nice building block. In developing countries, it's much more important. Sand. South Beach wouldn't be as nice if it was just rocks. The sand that you see on the beaches are produced by the reefs. Homes, that's a very obvious one. There are a lot of different species that rely on the reefs for food, shelter, reproduction. This obviously goes directly toward fisheries and tourism. South Florida relies greatly on fisheries and tourism. So it's really important we maintain these special ecosystems because it's a lot of our economy. And then this number is actually old, so I would anticipate it being higher, but the estimated global value is $375 billion every year, which is huge. That's huge, and they're disappearing. So it's in our best interest to maintain them. There's a lot of goods, but there's also a lot of bads. So 75% of the world's reefs are threatened, meaning they're disappearing. A third of all coral species are at risk of extinction. So there's something going on. Why is this? It's both natural and human-made stressors, but I would say a lot of human-made stressors are the bigger problem. So I will go into those very briefly. You can't quite see it, but this is just things that corals need. They're very specific in where they reside, where corals are best suited. I mean, you don't find corals up near New York or up in Oregon as much as you do around South Florida, and that's because they need certain temperature levels, light, water motion, water chemistry, and a healthy food web. So if they have all those things, corals will be fine. But you can see things like this are what corals want to avoid. Extremes, mostly in temperature. Coral bleaching is a word that's thrown around quite a bit that I'll get into, where temperatures can actually be too high or too low. Sedimentation, it was brought up earlier that the Port of Miami dredging project caused a lot of sediment in the water, and that actually smothered a lot of corals, resulting in their death. Excess nutrients is just mostly runoff, excess phosphorus and nitrogen in the water. That's just pretty much nutrients that other species rely on, so corals get outcompeted. Low salinity, and then also competition. So, threats. The big one is global climate change. This is a hot button topic these days. There's actually a big meeting going on in Paris soon regarding it. It's pretty much excess CO2 in the atmosphere. It's a big problem in terms of coral reefs because it causes 3 different issues. Temperature changes, mostly increases, which is going to lead to coral bleaching. You'll get ocean acidification, which means that the corals can't build their skeleton. So corals need to build skeleton to grow upward and maintain their level in the water column. They almost disintegrate because of ocean acidification. Sea level change. I think you guys have probably heard that Miami might sink soon. So the ocean is rising. And that's just causing corals to be deeper than they would like to be. And so it's another issue. Overfishing isn't talked about as much, but it's also a problem. Disease is talked about quite a bit in our community, but it's not understood very well. And then coastal development, which is another big one here for Miami. So, coral bleaching. A lot of people heard of it, but they're not sure exactly what it means. What it means is the corals that had that algae in their tissue kicked them out. They had a roommate that was giving them a lot of energy, but because temperature is too high, they get stressed out and they expel those symbionts. So the algae of the zooxanthellae, they kick them out, and that's why you see the white coloration. So it's because the zooxanthellae give them their brown, their pink, their purple, their blue color. When they kick out their roommates, so the zooxanthellae, they're left with just the white skeleton that you're seeing right here. And like I mentioned, they rely on these zooxanthellae for about 95% of their energy. So without that, they're kind of screwed. They kind of need to feed themselves. It's not their primary form of feeding, and so that's why you're seeing a lot of coral death. I just wanted to include some pictures so you can kind of see 2 coral colonies right by each other, one that had bleached, one that had not. It frequently, but not always, leads to death. So if a coral bleaches, it's not dead. People will talk about bleaching in Florida. That may lead to believe that corals are dead, but they can recover. It's not always that likely, but it does happen. And then it can be exaggerated. So El Nino, this is an El Nino year. This is just a map I wanted to include to show you bleaching events. So you can see it happens worldwide. And this year was actually declared the 3rd ever mass global bleaching event, which means the entire world experienced coral bleaching today because it was too warm. That's the 3rd time ever in the history of the world. So that was a scary year for us. Even worse is that this is probably the 6th mass bleaching event for the Florida Keys. So it's happening very frequently. You can see over there, that's a lot of dots where we're at. So this is the ocean acidification, what I mentioned. It's fairly dense, but like I said, it just means there's excess CO2 in the water. The excess CO2 inhibits coral growth for the most part. It's like the ocean turning to Coca-Cola. It's too acidic. And so the skeleton actually disintegrates. Corals aren't able to reproduce as easily. They're not able to settle as easily. It causes a bunch of energy or different issues that has like a synergistic effect. They combine each other. Overfishing. This one's seen a lot in the Caribbean. That's mostly just over-harvesting certain species at an unsustainable rate. You'll see it a lot in terms of parrotfish. So if parrotfish are harvested in excess, you're going to kind of tip the scales in terms of the ecological scale. So, for example, parrotfish graze on algae quite a bit. And so any algae that's on the reef is typically grazed by parrotfish. But if you remove the parrotfish, this algae is going to grow in excess of what it usually would, and it can actually outcompete corals. So you get more algal growth that's actually shading or smothering corals, and corals can die from this. So that's usually how it creates an unbalanced ecosystem. That's likely the case when you're talking about overfishing. But there are a lot of different ways you can see this as well. Disease. This one is important to mention, but it's poorly understood. In fact, the reason this species is listed as threatened is because of a disease that nearly wiped out populations in the 1970s, 1980s. Again, unknown what the vector was, what caused it, how to cure it. But disease runs rampant through the Caribbean. We see it almost every day out there, and we're not sure where it's coming from, why. We assume it's from other areas. It just kind of migrated, usually due to humans, but it's definitely a topic of interest. So the unfortunate thing about disease is if a coral is diseased, it's more susceptible to things like increased water temp, pollution, and therefore you're going to see more and more mortality or death. So, like I had said, it's especially important in the Caribbean because white band disease in the 1980s, 70s as well is what wiped out mostly all of the aquaporid species. So, both staghorn and elkhorn. Okay, and lastly, coastal development. I mentioned the Port of Miami dredging. A lot of the times when you erode shorelines, you're having an effect on coral reefs without knowing it. Mangroves are important nurseries to a lot of different reef species. So if you take away the mangroves, these reef species have nowhere to grow up and find nutrients, and therefore you're affecting their life cycle and a lot of times decreasing the chances of them surviving. Dredging, simply construction, can cause a lot of sediment up in the water column that actually smothers corals, can kill them. And then the last one is eutrophication, which is what I had mentioned for excess nutrients, where you're putting too much nitrogen or phosphorus in the water, and then algae is going to outcompete because it really likes to feed off those things. So this is kind of what the predicted model is going to look like if conditions continue as they are right now. This isn't increasing or decreasing. This is exactly how they are right now. You're going to see this transition to pretty much a desolate rubble reef. I mean, obviously there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things right now, but we're not doing them quick enough. So now that we are through the boring lecture part on coral reefs, I will begin to talk about coral restoration, what our laboratory does. Okay, so coral gardening. By show of hands, who had already heard of coral gardening? Nice, fair amount. Okay, so that is what our laboratory does. It's what we work on all year. All the research we do is in coral restoration, different types, the different most effective methods, the success rate, things like that. And our program, the Rescue Reef program, gives the opportunity to the public to join us. That's how it turns into a citizen science project. So I'll go over briefly here just the process. There are 4 steps. So 8 years ago when Dr. Learman began the laboratory, they collected really small pieces from a small amount of coral colonies to put in the nursery. I think in total they collected 60 fragments, about this big, total. Ever since then, they have been growing them in underwater nurseries. So there's some laboratories that grow them in the lab to transfer out to the reef. Our coral nurseries are already out in the middle of the ocean. In fact, our coral nursery is about 2 miles straight east off of Key Biscayne. And we've kind of hit it. I bet you couldn't find it if you tried, but it's out there. We have over 1,000 coral fragments out there. They're doing really well. So the next step is once you grow these corals in the underwater nursery, you then trim them or prune them to kind of increase your stock. So it's simple, it's just called fragmentation, where you literally cut off an arm of the coral colony and repopulate it somewhere else, and it'll just reproduce asexually. That's one of the beneficial characteristics of staghorn coral. So then the last step is to take all of the coral you've grown and put it back onto the reef. So you can see how we started with a very small amount of a threatened coral species, and we ended up with a large population that we grew on our own to then put back onto the reef. So it's a really effective method in kind of lessening the impact we're seeing in the disappearing reefs. So here is a visual display of the process. You can see right here, this is the fragmentation, simply using snips to just cut off a small piece of the coral, like that. Then putting it on blocks or lines or coral trees, whatever method you prefer, letting it grow to the desired size, getting really big, and then you fragment to put back onto the reef. So you can see here the diver is simply attaching the coral to a piece of nail that has been hammered into the reef substrate, and there you go. That's the final product like I showed you earlier. So that's a piece of staghorn coral that is on a reef, a masonry nail with the zip tie epoxied, and here's what it kind of looked like, I think about 10 months later if I recall. You can see this was a boat scar where a boat had grounded, and the laboratory was called in to kind of restore that area by transplanting the corals from the nursery to the boat scar. So to give you guys a better idea, this is our model of a coral tree. So our coral nursery has 10 trees in it. The trees are about 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide, so I mean literally about me standing out there like this. They're hovered above the ground, so we anchor them to the reef substrate, or the sand, and we buoy them up so they just float in the water just like this. And each arm has about 12 coral fragments growing on it. And so with the 12, or the couple hundred on each tree, plus the 10 trees, we have over 1,000 corals in our nursery. So we'll do things like clean, collect, take samples, and whatever we need to from the coral nursery. To outplant, it's pretty simple here. We have my representation of the coral reef. We'll hammer a masonry nail right into the reef substrate, and then we'll just take our coral fragment that we're using to transplant, put it flush against the nail, and zip tie, and that's it. So it's pretty straightforward. It takes a little trial and error, but it's pretty straightforward. So we've had a lot of success with that. Here's showing how fast the coral can grow. There's what the corals started as. There's 8 months later. Then they were pruned, so pretty much just they cut the top of the coral colony off, and that's another 8 months later. So you can see it's very fast. When we put the corals in the right conditions, in the right area, they grow really, really well. And so we're able to keep doing this process over and over and over and over, and it's worked extremely well. So like I've been saying over and over, we're using staghorn coral, and the reason it works so well in this area is because it was already the reef-building coral in the Caribbean. So it's supposed to be here. It just died off because of disease, but it's supposed to be here. It grows really fast, as you can see by the pictures. And the fact that when you fragment, it just reproduces asexually really works well for us, because then we just break off a branch and put it on another tree, and break off another branch and put it on another tree, and the process can be replicated over and over and over again. So here are some different structures you'll see pretty much worldwide. We use the ones in the top right, the coral trees, so that's a better visualization of what they look like to scale. They're fairly large, but we use blocks mainly for specific experiments. Reef balls are sometimes used. A-frames are a lot in the Caribbean. It's pretty much whatever they have access to, because in developing countries they have to use what they have, and so you'll see a lot of variations of these, but they all work really well. So what are the goals? Why do we do coral reef restoration? Obviously the first step is to minimize how much we collect from the wild. If you're taking a lot of corals from the wild and putting them somewhere else in the wild, you're just degrading the reef you collected from. So we minimize that. Maximize productivity in the coral nursery, so we try and grow as many corals as possible. And then produce a sustainable source for genetically diverse corals. That's important because if we planted 500 of me out there, that's a lot less sustainable in terms of if we planted 500 of us out there. It just makes for a better population overall, and it's better for resilience going forward, or the survivability of the reef. Okay, so this is kind of our picture. This is completely up to date in numbers. We have 3 nurseries all along the reef track. So you can see we're all the way up here. This is Key Biscayne right there. And you're looking at the Key Largo area. So all of our nurseries extend that whole way. Every blue dot is a reef that we've restored to, or restored for the most part, outplanted to. And our total number is over 7,600 corals now, outplanted to the reef. A way to kind of visualize that is if we outplanted this coral today and we waited about 1 year, it would grow to roughly the size of a basketball. So think about that. If we outplanted 7,600 corals, that's 7,600 basketballs on the reef now. And when we outplant, we already sometimes outplant coral colonies that are about a basketball size. So it's a lot of reef structure, quite a bit. And our success rate is about 85 to 90%, so the number of outplants doesn't match up to how many have survived, but it's still very high. Yeah?
This just came into my head. Since corals are animals, can they move?
So these corals can't move. There are some free-living corals that can kind of like crawl. Those aren't very common. Most other corals, they want to attach to the ground as quickly as possible because they hate moving. Their whole thing is I don't want to go anywhere. So they actually cement themselves to the reef. Yeah.
I still don't understand, like, why are coral reefs considered an animal instead of a plant?
So, it's a good question. So, this is the coral colony, right? And this is the actual skeleton. So there's no animal on this.
Yeah.
And this is made of calcium carbonate, but just think of it as a skeleton, like a bone.
Okay.
But every little kind of bump you can see on here, that's an individual coral's home. So one little coral polyp, like the guy that's trying to grab the Skittles, that's one coral polyp. So you can see that on here, all these little tiny bumps, that's hundreds of coral polyps, which is one animal. So there's hundreds of animals on this one branch.
Yeah, but why isn't, like, let's just say the coral polyp? Why is it considered an animal instead of a plant?
So because they're just holding the plant inside their cells. So I mean, if this was a coral tentacle, they just have little tiny coral, the algae, the plants living inside them, but they themselves are like an animal, just like a jellyfish or an octopus or something like that. Yeah.
Have you ever found, like, animals like fish inside your nurseries?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, all the time. When we're in our coral nurseries, because there's, like I said, there's 10 of these giant trees. There's fish all over the place. There's squid, little crabs live on these guys. Tons of stuff. They love the coral nurseries.
What happens when there's a storm?
A storm.
Your tree?
If we know it's going to be a really big storm, we'll probably go and try and either remove the trees or the corals just because we don't lose them. But if there's just one that kind of isn't anticipated, we just cross our fingers. The type of anchor we use is called like a duckbill, and it's actually really sturdy. So I'm assuming they've withstood some strong winds out there. We did actually lose one tree this year. We had 9 and we ended up with 8 when we just went back about 2 weeks ago. That could be lobster traps, the ropes pulling them out. That could be weather. We don't know. But it's definitely something that can happen.
Are they affected by the red tide?
Not that we've seen, I don't think. I don't know if they've been in that area. I'm not sure, to be honest.
That's on West Coast.
Yeah, I haven't seen it. I'm not sure if they have nurseries over there, to be honest with you. Yeah.
Do you ever worry about if, like, a debris from the ocean, like, I don't know, like a lobster cage, hits the tree or like the little...
Definitely. In fact, that was one of the things we're kind of worried about is that we had been missing a tree. And we could, when we were diving, we could see that there are these lobster traps all connected with ropes pretty close to our nursery. So there's a good shot that when they were pulling them back up to see what their catch was, they just caught a branch and pulled the tree up with them. So it's definitely a problem, and we're looking into a way to try and get a research buoy put up there, because right now they're hidden. I mean, you can't tell where they are from just being on the top of the water. But we're worried that if there's a research buoy, it'll attract additional attention. So we're kind of at a crossroads.
You said coral reefs weren't too deep, but exactly how deep are they?
So typically corals will, it varies quite a bit, but the corals that we'll see in Florida here are around 30 feet underwater. So all of our diving is around 30 feet.
What about other kinds of corals aside the alcohol? What are you doing about those?
The only other coral that's used mostly for restoration work is the palmata, which is the large flat branching, because that's a threatened species as well. That's usually in the Caribbean, just because we don't actually see it almost at all here, because it just isn't suitable anymore. It used to be, but it's not anymore. And so it wouldn't be worth our while to try and restore those populations when we know they won't survive. But in the Caribbean, they do a lot of work with that. Otherwise, besides staghorn and palmata, all species grow far too slow to be worth your while, where you'll collect a piece the size of a golf ball and it'll take 3 years for it to, you know.
That's a brain coral.
Yeah.
What about the elkhorn?
The elkhorn, it's a little slower than the staghorn, but yeah, that's a lot in the Caribbean, they'll use that. But it's still less than the staghorn for some reason. I think just because cost efficiency wise, it's easier to deal with the staghorn because it's smaller, easier to handle, easier to attach to the reef. And a lot of these endeavors are, you know, nonprofits or low funded, so it comes down to money.
And if you have that, it's like growing on land one kind of pine tree or something.
Somewhat, yeah. The only reason it's somewhat different is if that one pine tree was near extinction. So
yeah.
Thankfully the species that we're working with is near extinction. So the fact that we're restoring populations is highly beneficial, not only for that specific population, but because in the 60s and 70s, staghorn dominated the Florida area. So it used to be the main coral, and now it's the least common coral. So that's why we're working so hard with that particular species. Yeah.
If polyp is an algae, then how come other algae affect?
That's a good question. So the polyp is the animal, but it's got the little tiny microscopic algae living inside of it. The algae I'm talking about that can outcompete corals are like tall, like plant. They look like a normal plant, like a bush or something. And so you can see how if there was a tall bush next to just a little tiny coral, it could shade it, it could smother it, and that it's called macroalgae because it means macro like big, so big algae. Yeah.
Are there any like invasive species of coral?
Not necessarily. I actually haven't heard of any invasive corals. That's a really good question. But I think it's just because corals can't really move on their own. You know, like I told her, they cement the reef. They don't like moving. So unless humans pick them up and put them in another area where they could technically be called invasive.
Yeah, they don't like move.
Yeah. So I think that's the only reason, thankfully.
But you said that there are some that do.
Mm-hmm. There are some free-moving colonies, but I think they're so uncommon that they kind of reside in their own area. They don't like crawling very far.
Oh, and like, how far could they crawl? Like, how fast?
I don't think they're. The reason I don't know much about them is I don't think there's any in the Florida area. They are in the Indo-Pacific, I think, but they can probably crawl a decent amount. I think they move slow though, like a slug is the best way to picture it.
Is the Port of Miami going to mitigate the damage that they caused?
I think I just heard that they are going to be more responsible than they had already thought they were responsible for. A new study just came out by NOAA. I think NOAA's finally backing pretty much all the conservationists, saying what you said you were going to do was not even near what you did. So I don't actually know how it's going to play out, but the fact that NOAA is now supporting the fact that they're to blame is good.
And what type of coral was what? Were they
Damage.
destroyed?
So unfortunately, when they did their dredging, any normal type of coral that they smothered and killed, they weren't responsible for. But because this is protected by the Endangered Species Act, the fact that they killed any at all was against the law of the United States. And so that's why they were held accountable. And so that's why we were allowed to recover them. So it's environmental law looks for loopholes where the fact that the dredging was occurring in the first place was going to be very damaging to the entire ecosystem, but you can't do anything pretty much unless you have a species like this that's there to throw a red flag. And so it was fortunate that these were there in terms of, you know, it helped with the mitigation process, but the fact that any corals were dying, period, was kind of a black eye on the process. I know there was a question over here.
Yes,
Yeah.
You were talking about the staghorn coral being asexual, or most corals asexual?
It's a good question. So I actually had that slide in there and I deleted it just because I didn't want to drag too long. But some corals are spawners where they produce eggs and sperm into the water column to then combine, turns into a little baby coral, lands on the reef, reproduces, grows that way. Some mix the sperm and eggs inside of them, and then they release the little baby coral that settles. But these corals can do both. So they can also produce or reproduce sexually by releasing eggs and sperm, which does happen, but because colonies are so dispersed, they never combine. So they are primarily asexual, so they rely on fragmentation. Yeah?
About how many babies is a coral?
Polyps or babies? I honestly don't. It really varies. Like, if I had to guess on this coral colony right here of staghorn, I'm thinking like 200 or 300. But like I said, we can get corals this large, so you're looking at thousands then. And some species have, what's that?
It depends on the size.
Oh, 100%. And a good example is there's a species called Montastria cavernosa, where their polyps are like this big, each one. So you can see it, it's huge. So they would have a lot less. So it can really vary. Yeah.
I always find like little pieces of rose corals on the beach,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering since they usually live far in the ocean, how is the tide able to bring them that far onto the beach?
The ocean's strong, really strong. So that's just a coral that happened to die out in the reef, which could be 3 miles out there, that just rolled in eventually, because the water is just, it's relentless. I mean, all day, every day.
Can animals carry like other sea animals carry them around?
Bring it around?
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe a curious dolphin grabbed a piece and brought it up. I'm not sure. It's hard to say, but you never know. I've seen crazy things underwater, so I wouldn't doubt it. I got a few more slides left, then we'll open it up to any more. So, like I said, this is the Rescue Reef program. It's mostly designed to support our research and restoration, not only in terms of assisting us, but helping with our ongoing research and our data collection. So it's special because it's educational. We're teaching people about coral reefs, the importance of them, the different stressors, but they're going to do it hands-on. They're right next to us, they're helping us, and I really think it ends up a larger take-home message when someone's helping instead of just learning. So here's another visualization of our corals. One thing I had mentioned to a few before is that the Port of Miami dredging was kind of a special story because the corals they went in and rescued went into our nurseries. These are the corals that would have died from the dredging had it not been for NOAA and our university collecting them to then put them into our coral nursery. So this is a picture from December when we first collected the corals, and this is what they look like in June. So you could see they grew very well. Yeah.
What is a dredging?
So good question. So dredging is, so they have the port where the big ships come in, right? The big cruise ships. That's where they go every day, all day. Dredging is where they pretty much dig more sand out of the water to just make it deeper. They just want to make it deeper so that bigger boats can go through. Because right now, huge boats would hit the sand in the bottom, so they're digging it deeper. But when they dig, a lot of sand gets blown up into the water, and the sand ends up settling in areas it wasn't usually at, and a lot of times that sand will cover up the corals. So that's what dredging is. Yeah?
About how strong is a coral about that size?
In terms of like, to break it,
Yes.
I probably couldn't break it with my hand. Okay, I did break it with my hand. This was a small piece, but they're very strong. And that's the one thing that ocean acidification, that's the reason it's a problem, is because they're very strong usually, but when they live in Coca-Cola or acidic ocean water, it kind of disintegrates them, and then they're more likely to break, which is not good for them. But usually, that's why we use these wire snips, I think they are, so that we can actually fragment them that way, because it works a lot easier. So, like I said, here's the nursery. You can see that after, I think it was 6 months, that's how well the corals were doing. So I would say we doubled the amount of live tissue in terms of the branches and size and the linear extension of the branches. So you can see that corals that would have died, we were able to double, maybe triple the amount, and then continue to repopulate from those. And to answer the question earlier, you can see here the hogfish just hanging out in our coral nursery. So it's pretty popular for normal reef species.
Was that grown in Biscayne Bay?
This?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's right off Key Biscayne. This is about 2 miles east. I don't know where east is, but about 2 miles east. That way? Okay. And you can see here, this is the rope that anchors it to the bottom. So this is just free floating in the ocean.
So now you've got to take it and plan every one of those somehow so it gets attached.
We do. Yes.
How do you attach it?
That's the next step.
Oh, okay.
I'll show you. So then the next step is collection, obviously. Well, we're at the nursery. We clean all the branches. You get a lot of overgrowth. You get algae, you get crustaceans, fire coral that grow over the branches and the monofilament. We just hang it using pretty much fishing line. And you can see it's like a Christmas ornament. We just hang them on every branch. And then, so we clean them. We use a wire brush, and we just clean all the branches, clear the algae, the encrusting coral, what have you. We'll take some coral measurements if we need to. We'll count, collect, and then we'll transport. So here's a squid, by the way. That was a good picture. But you can see then we put them in just a cooler to then transport to a reef. We actually kind of select our own reefs. We have special permits for certain areas, but we typically look for what reef we feel is considered degraded, and we'd like to restore there. So we bring the coral up from our coral nursery, put it on the boat, we go to the reef, and then that's outplanting. So you can see here, this is individual divers. These are just citizens of Miami that joined us, that wanted to learn about our program. So you can see they have the hammer in their nail that they're going to drive right into the coral reef substrate. So this is just limestone. You want to make sure the nail's sturdy. You'll take your single coral fragment one at a time. You'll just put it flush against that masonry nail, and you'll zip tie it. Usually we do 2 zip ties. Sometimes we'll use colors to kind of coat it, depending on what reef we're at, the date, so we can track the growth process. After about 2 to 3 months, you'll see the coral has kind of started to cement itself to the ocean floor, as well as kind of wrap around the nail and the zip tie. So it'll kind of engulf those. And then after about, I would say, 6 to 7 months, you won't even know the nail or zip tie are there. The tissue is grown over. And after about a year, like I'd said, it's a good estimate to say it's about a basketball. So you can see there, those divers are working to put the nails in and attach the coral. And these are some final products. So this is the special photograph. This coral is maybe this big. That's how big that is, right? That's not very large. This is 3 years later. That's huge. They survived a bleaching event, so they were near death, they recovered, and now they're healthy populations. We took this picture a month and a half ago. So that's really impressive. That means a lot of the corals we're putting out there are surviving, and this is a sexually mature coral, so that could reproduce sexually, which is really big. That's where they're looking for the future. Yeah?
How many times a year do you like go down and collect and
Every day, almost.
every day?
If a 5 working day week, we can go 2 or 3 times doing 5 or 6 dives. I started in May, and I've done 120 dives since then, which some people haven't done in their lifetime. We dive a lot. So you can see they're kind of pretty looking. They look nice. Yeah?
Do you fertilize those areas at all?
No, we don't have to do anything. The corals are naturally supposed to be there, so the fact that we just put them where they're supposed to be, they do just fine. Yeah?
So you have these trees that you're putting the coral on.
Mm-hmm.
Can you do that in the lab and then bring the trees down and put them in? I mean, would the coral die if you were working with it in the lab?
So it wouldn't die. We've never done that route, but it would be stressed out. We try and keep the coral in water at all times if we have to transport, just because they're kind of picky, to be honest with you. They get upset very easily, and so they'll slough off a lot of mucus, which is a defense mechanism. So I think that would cause more problems than it would solve. But we just did this process last week. We put down brand new coral trees. We took one large coral colony and fragmented it into 12 pieces to then hang on an individual arm, so we could track genotypes and colonies. It takes about an hour and a half long dive to repopulate just one tree, and we did 6 that day. So it was about 6 hours of diving total. We had 3 divers, 2 apiece. Yeah.
That photo on the right of the little coral.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's about the size of a basketball, right?
It's I would say a lot bigger. I would say
Like that big?
I would say it's about this big.
So
Like a big exercise ball. That's exactly what I would say. It's near. So it's really large. In fact, you'll rarely see corals that size in the wild. So that means that these corals are pretty resilient. They're doing really well. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about that. So the plastic doesn't bother them?
It doesn't. The masonry nail and the plastic doesn't seem to deter them at all. It's the most effective way we found to attach them. Like I said, the coral tissue is fairly quick and actually just growing over top the zip tie and over top the nail. So if you looked as hard as you could, you would have no idea where that was. The one thing that there's some research out is you can see right here, there's a white putty. It's called epoxy. It's like an underwater cement. We like using that for smaller pieces just because when you attach a coral to the reef, it knows something's up. And so its first thing will be to cement to the reef. Because like I said, they don't want to move. So they'll focus all their energy on cementing to the reef first before they do any growth. So by putting that cement there, we feel like we can mimic them cementing themselves to the reef. So we use it somewhat fairly often, not all the time. And there's a little bit of debate out there whether that makes them more susceptible to disease. There's no evidence yet. Like I said, we're kind of weaning off because we don't want to do anything. If it's not necessary, we're not going to do it. Because a lot of times we'll outplant large coral colonies about yay big, and we don't require epoxy for that. But otherwise, no, the masonry nail and the zip ties, harm-free. Yeah?
Yeah, this is a rescue and restore a reef. That implies that something killed the coral on that reef. Yet, 3 years later, you have that reef that's doing very well. Do you have any clues about what changed and why?
So coral, definitely along the Florida Reef Tract, coral cover has declined drastically. Mainly in this area, it's been disease. Like I said, so this species mostly died off in the 70s, 80s because of disease. Other populations, such as Montaster, like boulder coral, brain coral, Paredes, which is like finger coral, that's gonna be a lot of bleaching. So there's been 6 bleaching events in the Caribbean, which is cutting populations in half every summer. And so that's where you're seeing these reefs dying, is the coral bleaching. These are exacerbated by sedimentation, eutrophication, you name it, overfishing.
It suggests that they can come back. I'm wondering
well,
what
certainly.
the factors are that.
So I mean, well, this is how I would say the populations are coming back, because this is a population that wasn't there before we had our outplant. So in terms of restoring the reef or rescuing the reef, we're definitely increasing population size along the entire Florida Reef Tract. Like we've been fairly successful in terms of, like I said, 85 to 90% of all of our outplants survive the first year. And after 1 year, we then dub that no longer an outplant, but a normal part of the wild. So if we encountered this coral in the wild and we're doing one of our normal surveys, we would count that as a normal wild colony because it's surpassed the 1 year point. So it's definitely now a contribution to the reef that's, cycling, doing nutrient cycling, providing habitat. If it fragments, it could be reproducing. So there's a lot of benefits to it in terms of what it was before the outplant occurred, in the most part. Yeah.
When have you started the garden?
When?
When?
It started 8 years ago when Dr. Lierman's lab began. That was when his research began. It's been growing a lot ever since. For a long time, they had only one nursery way south near Biscayne National Park, the headquarters. It's grown when funding has come in and there's been more success. One of the special things about our laboratory is it's one of the only ones that does research to see the different successful methods, the different successful genotypes, things like that, whereas you'll get a foundation like the Coral Restoration Foundation, CRF. They're very popular and they outplant a lot of corals, but they don't collect any data. And so they're still helping, don't get me wrong, they're a great program that's doing a lot of great work, but the special thing about our program is we've been keeping data this entire time, and so we've been able to pretty much perfect in terms of success rates in both the nursery and the outplanting methodology. Yeah?
Is there any law against destroying coral reefs?
This coral, yes. So you're not allowed to harm, harass, take, kill, pest, like anything involved in this coral, because it's a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act. You're not allowed to do it. It's highly advised not to tamper with normal corals either, just because they're pretty sensitive in terms of a lot of humans can either harm them by directly killing them, contracting some type of disease that's unknown, a lot of different things. So people advise highly not to touch corals, but only a few are illegal by law. Yeah.
Do you have any coral trees that have continued growing since the first days of this project was started?
Somewhere there is a coral that's from the very beginning, because all the coral we've collected has technically never left our nursery completely. Because every year, so this is a great example. Right now, we were at our lowest amount of coral, where we've outplanted almost all of our coral that we grew over the winter to nearly empty, and then we use those few remaining coral colonies like this to fragment and then put them back on brand new trees to then grow November, December, January, February, and then about March we'll start outplanting again. So because one little piece might make it, technically the coral we collected 8 years ago is probably somewhere in the reef or the nursery somewhere. So it's a good question. Yeah?
Are there any of those corals growing naturally
Yeah,
near the marine state?
Ooh, I'm not sure. That's a good question. If you could find it, that would help a lot. With all, if I can go diving one afternoon, if I can find something, that'd help you a lot.
Could we plant some there?
We find a couple colonies with a nail and zip ties down there, and all of a sudden the trucks stop going. I like it. Yeah.
That's a good question, though. Would it still be illegal?
You would be.
Right, because it's still the...
Honestly, environmental lawyers look really hard, where if there's any connection between harm, take, harass, anything, in terms of a threatened species, the process stops. But unfortunately, there wouldn't be any coral in that area. Yeah?
What's the biggest coral you found?
Me personally?
Yeah.
This type of coral or any coral?
Any coral.
Big. I saw, it's called like boulder coral or Montastria cavernosa. It's just like a big half circle. It was on the ground, it was probably this big. And it was like huge. It was like a dome. I couldn't describe it. It was really big though. It surprised me. Yeah.
What is the biggest coral tree?
They're all the exact same. So they're all 6 feet by about 6 feet. So if you can imagine, so if I'm the center pole and one arm has the corals hanging on it, there's 12 branches. So it'd be like if I had a lot of arms.
Like, I mean, like the coral growth. Like,
oh,
big are the corals?
How big are the corals? We try and make sure they don't get too big because as you can see, they kind of hang right next to each other. So if they get too large, they bump into each other. And sometimes they actually fuse if they're nice coral species where some, imagine if you were friends with him but not him. So you don't want to grow next to him, but you want to grow next to him. So we try and make sure they don't get too close. So if they get really large, that's when we fragment or prune them to give them more breathing room, if you will. But it's actually really interesting because we get corals that are really like spindly or really skinny, and some that are just fat, like huge, dense branches. And that's just based on what kind of coral it is, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What material is the tree made in?
Good question. So the arms are just PVC pipe. The little loops that are holding the coral is just monofilament, which is pretty much a fishing line. And then there's little silver pieces here that I think are called crimps or something like that, where we just use that to kind of pinch it onto there. Otherwise, there's anchors that are going down holding it in the sand, and a buoy on top that's just making sure it floats upright. So we actually have to add buoys quite a bit because when there's more coral growth, it gets heavier, and so we have to add buoys to make sure it stays upright.
These gorgonians, the things that move around, they're corals too, right?
Gorgonian is a type of, I don't want to misspeak actually. I think it's a type of octocoral, where it's like a sea fan. It's the big, big purple. Yeah, Gorgonians. I think it's a type of soft coral or octocoral. I think. They're not hard coral.
But it does have the zooanthilli in it too, right?
Yes. Yeah. But they rely a lot on the water motion. One interesting little fact is they always grow perpendicular to the shoreline. So if you're ever lost at sea, go against the
Well, you're
Gorgonians.
either then going towards the shore or away from it.
That's true. It's a coin flip. It's a coin flip, but
Right.
yeah. Yeah.
So, and when you describe this huge coral, it's just the outside of it that's alive, right? I mean,
Yes. So that's a great question, actually. So because all the corals are shaped differently, the one thing to keep in mind is that this is the skeleton. There's just a thin layer of tissue on all parts of the outside of the coral skeleton, and that's the only place that there are coral polyps, which is the animal. All the rest inside, so that giant dome, everything inside is just skeleton, just rock. So there's only a thin layer on the outside, and this thin layer is able to reproduce and just kind of branch off. Like when a starfish loses an arm, grows an arm back, these guys are able to just split in half and just keep reproducing, and that's how they kind of grow along the reef floor. Yeah?
Are corals related to starfish?
Kind of distantly, but yeah. Yeah. They're closer to like jellyfish and anemones. Any other questions? Oh, I don't even know if I'm done. Oh yeah, I'm done. One thing I would recommend is we have a Facebook and an Instagram, so check out Rescue Reef, and we do have a website as well. The website's got all of our publications, information about the program. The Facebook page lets you know all of our, when we're out planning, how our lab's doing, when our next expeditions are, and Instagram just puts up pretty pictures of corals. So feel free to follow any of them.